Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our last presentation in the fall lineup for S&T's Global Learning Speaker Series. I'm Caprice Moore, Interim Vice Provost for Global Learning. I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Ms. Anitra Rivera, Director of S&T's Student Diversity Initiatives. As an advocate for diversity and inclusion of all individuals, Anitra is engaged in a wide variety of diversity initiatives on and off campus, and she's responsible for our Cultural Competencies Education Program and serves as advisor to the Diversity Leadership Council. This afternoon, Anitra will share her perspective and research on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Feel free to post your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll save a few minutes at the end for Q&A. Anitra, you have the Zoom platform.
Thank you, Dr. Moore, for that introduction. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So in a competitive world where we feel safe and secure when we feel in control, I find myself fascinated by our brain and the processes that we simply have no control over. But it's refreshing to know that we can do some things to change outcomes and to increase our awareness. My hope is that you join this chat today to learn more about how you can have a positive impact on the climate, the culture, and the structure in your workplace by learning about how cognitive bias impacts attitudes, actions, and decisions that we are making in the workplace. So I'd like to start with a disclaimer that the concepts I introduce have a lot of depth and breadth in them, and we won't get into all of that within this 20 to 25-minute time frame, but I do want to provide this teaser and hope that you find it interesting enough to reach out to my department, Student Diversity Initiatives, for more specific and detailed training and educational opportunities, because we will cater to your group. You can initiate this by going to our website, it's sdi.mst.edu, and clicking on Training and Education Curriculum. If you don't see the educational opportunity of your interest, click Training Needs Questionnaire and a member of my team will reach out to you. So now that we've got that out the way, let's get started. I do have, the PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share, but I do want you to feel free to chime in and ask questions or share your experiences whenever you feel necessary. So here's a roadmap for today's talk. I'll start with some foundational things like definitions and explanations, just to make sure that we're on the same page. I'll go over some examples of how these things actually show up in the workplace, have shown up in the news, and maybe even in society with regards to laws and things like that. If you have anything to share, you're welcome to share as well. And then we'll discuss some action steps so you can leave this chat with something to actually do to make a positive impact on your workplace. So we like to start our diversity and inclusion trainings with simply defining diversity. So think about that for a second. When you think about diversity and what it means to you, what does it encompass? Well, first of all, it's important to know that diversity is such a huge term. I mean, it encompasses so much. It's a big task to define it because it is really complex and it covers a lot. But to keep it basic, diversity means difference. We are diverse beings with a number of traits that make us uniquely ourselves. Our identity is made up of these traits. And if you look at my diversity wheel here, you'll see in the middle, I have core identities, and those are really things that we really don't have much control over. And I'll let you read those and think about your own core identities. And then we have those identities on the outside of the wheel, and those are things that tend to change as we go through life that we do have some control over. So each person is very unique from other individuals because these core identities and these other identities, they intersect to make us unique beings, unique individuals. So one important thing to note is that when we look at people, the brain doesn't see people for all of these different, distinct identities, okay? The brain likes to make things simple and it does things pretty automatic. So the brain processes people into categories and to groups initially. So, in other words, our brain wants to automatically make assumptions about people as part of a group. For example, upon first meeting me, your brain may process me as a part of the female group and all the assumptions that go with that. Okay. That's important to know and realize because you want to get in the habit of questioning your assumptions, your gut feelings, and take action to get to know the difference, get to know people for these unique traits, get past that primitive process of that automatic um, categorization of identity. Okay. So you don't know my identity if I don't tell you. I may not be a part of that female group, okay? I may be gender non-conforming. And it's important to realize that you don't want to just assume that people are a part of these norms or these social constructs that society has created, that we have accepted so often. And this is important in our workplace because we want to be inclusive of all of these identities. And if you look at the identity wheel, there are so many. So that is really important to note when thinking about diversity and inclusion. So inclusion is very important, and you can tell by all the participants in this chat. I know that there are people from all of our stakeholders. We might have some alumni on here. We may have students, people who are in vast roles, maybe employee, supervisor, leadership, making strategic decisions, but we all have a role in making sure that our environment is inclusive. And inclusion can mean so many things. It can be how a person feels. It can be policies to ensure people are not excluded based upon their differences, especially those differences that are protected, okay? So hopefully you're reading the slides as I go along. I'm trying to give you additional information so you can read these. But if you look at what I have here, part of that last sentence, it says all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. And in a work environment where people feel safe, they feel secure, again, we have that control where people can contribute, they can share their full self, they can bring their whole identity, all of their background and experience to the workplace to increase efficiency, productivity, competitive advantage for a company, then they need that psychological safety. That means creating an environment that would encourage that, recognizing and rewarding individuals for their contributions and ideas. If someone doesn't feel safe, they're not going to speak up because maybe someone else's bias has caused them to ignore someone's contribution or take credit. There's so many different ways that bias can manifest. But right now we're talking about inclusion and recognizing the psychological safety of that and providing that opportunity for someone to take risk and to share. Also, there is that, physical or structural safety that we can have and create too. So we want to make sure that our workplace is accessible to everyone and we have physical spaces needed for people to thrive. We want to make sure that that's equitable. People have their desks, they have all the tools that they need, they have ability to access their workspace no matter what their different abilities are. Also, that could be something as simple as having a gender neutral restroom. People shouldn't have to out themselves or identify to this binary construct in order to feel safe enough to just do something simple like using the bathroom. So we have inclusion with regards to like psychological safety and the physical and structural things that we can do. And then we also need to note that the EEOC protects different classes of people. And there are different things that, you can work with HR and like your equity department to get past that, that just the psychological safety and things like that. But can you think of additional ways that a workplace can be inclusive to people with differences? If you have any that you want to share, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll go over those at the end. Bias. Okay, so cognitive bias is very complicated, and it's so complicated that you have so many different people from different academic disciplines looking at it, like social psychologists. You have people looking at like neuroscientists, psychologists, all types of people. You have me. I'm just very interested in it. It is complicated, but I like to make it simple, and I look at it as a preference for or against something. But when thinking about it with the workplace, is for or against someone. Okay. And so this is an automatic response. Some social psychologists, and in particular, Dr. Susan Fisk, has looked at bias as behaviors from intergroup effect and stereotypes. And there's actually like a map of this. So if you're interested in this, jot this down because there are some theories, there's a whole map and a lot of information about it. But it basically talks about how our brain does these primitive processes to keep us safe, and these are things that have happened since the beginning of time and probably since like the ice age. And to keep us safe, our brain has this way of evaluating stimulus, like, is this a good person for me? Is this person going to hurt me? So our brain is going to respond initially like good for me or bad for me. And again, it's very primitive. It's positive or it's negative. It's pretty simple. Intergroup emotions theory, that describes emotional assessments on behalf of one's in-group. And so that's an extension of that appraisal of theories of emotion. And so when we think about how the brain will group people as a part of our in-group versus those in the out-group, in-group are people like us, okay? So whether we like it or not, whether we are aware of it or not, and usually we're not aware of it, we sort the world into us versus them categories. We are more likely to treat people with bias that we feel are outside of our own in group. So if you think back to the diversity wheel, anyone that is different from ourselves, our brain automatically categorizes them as a part of the out group. Familiarity breeds comfort, it breeds likability. And with our primitive responses, we have a preference for people in our group. Okay, so what does that really mean for the workplace? It means problems because those who are not in our group, we're not going to like them as much. Our primitive response would be to not be accepting of them, not want to work with them, not reach out to them because we have decided in our brain, our initial response, that they're going to harm us or that they're going to be competing against us. They're not as warm. They're not good for us. They're on the negative end. So, unfortunately, it is automatic, it's subliminal, and it's immediate. But there's something that we can do about it. And mainly, that's finding out more about it, finding out more about our bias. So social psychologists have also found ways to learn about your bias. The implicit association test is one of those. It's a free test that you can take. You can Google implicit association test, or you can Google IAT, and you can take this test. And basically, it measures how quickly you sort words or pictures into different categories. For example, if you were asked to categorize ice cream as good or bad, you'd probably quickly categorize it as good. Most of you would, and I know I'm assuming here. But if you were that person that when you eat ice cream and you start getting brain freezes, then you may not be so quick to categorize ice cream as a good thing. Okay, so it's the IAT actually measures that too. So it'll measure that hesitation. And if you relate that to the workplace, the more you learn about and find out about these different identities, groups, cultures, anything that's different from your own self, the more that hesitation is going to take place, the more that questioning, that assumption, that gut feeling, that subliminal, that instant reaction is going to take place. And that's why there's so much talk about like diversity, equity, and inclusion training, learn more about different people so you can try to minimize the impact of those primitive responses. So related to group biases, people may claim that they don't discriminate against outgroups. And remember, outgroups are those groups that are different from our own selves. And that could be true, but when they're given the computer task to categorize people from these outgroups, that automatic or unconscious or implicit bias does show up, okay? And studies have showed that people are mostly fast at pairing their own group with good categories compared to that of the what's considered the outgroups. Bottom line here with the bias is we never want to make assumptions. We want to treat every individual as unique, as that unique and distinctly different individual. We want to find out about people for their own selves and not their groups, because you see there, stereotype is the cognitive side of intergroup bias. It's the beliefs about groups, and we want to question those stereotypes, minimize the negative reactions so we can make our workplace inclusive. So bias has shown up so much in the workplace that there are so many news articles about it. And I've only picked a couple to share because I wanted to provide an opportunity for you to think about and share some of the ways that bias has maybe shown up in a workplace or an experience or maybe a news article that resonated with you. So if you have one, please share it in the chat and I'll pause and we can check that out. But I wanted to start with the Crown Act. I don't know if you've heard of the Crown Act, but the House has actually just passed the Crown Act. It's HR 5309. It stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair Act of 2020, or it's known as the Crown Act of 2020. But the bill prohibits discrimination based upon a person's hair texture or hairstyle if that style or texture is associated with the particular race or national origin. And so when we're talking about being inclusive, we want people to be able to show up to the workplace. They shouldn't be discriminated or wrote up because their hair isn't within some random or arbitrary standards for professionalism. So I believe that 7 states right now have passed laws prohibiting this type of discrimination. And right now, the status at the federal level is that it's waiting in the Senate. So that's something interesting to follow. So the next article, I think is really timely because with COVID happening and people having to work from home, people being furloughed, people being let go, you have cases of caregiver bias. And unfortunately, women are being impacted. So females are experiencing bias because employers are assuming that they're going to have to take care of young children in comparison with their male counterparts. So they're experiencing cases of caregiver bias and are experiencing more furloughs than males. And so that's an article that I shared. Mothers' careers are at extraordinary risk right now. So think about that. That's really tough. And then the third article I shared is Laughed Out of the Interviews, Trans Workers Discuss Job Discrimination. So there is bias against transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, and gender non-conforming employees. And, when you grow up in a world where the social construct of binary, female versus male, anything different, people's brains just don't know how to respond to that, or people may feel uncomfortable. And that's very unfortunate. And people shouldn't have to out themselves in order to be included in that workplace. They shouldn't have to conform in order to go to a job interview and not be, laughed out of it. That's really unfortunate. So that's, when that bias it goes farther than just you minimizing this primitive response. But there are some things that definitely you can do. And that is creating policies that don't require someone to out themselves, okay? So reduce the amount of gender information that you require. It's not necessary. I was reading articles where people have disclosed to their employer that they're transitioning, and the employers, in response, they sent an email out to everyone stating that information and just, starting to have trainings and things like that. Well, to me, that's really unnecessary. Those trainings should already be happening. I know at our university, we have signatures with pronouns. We are taking steps to train people on pronouns. We have safe space. We have all sorts of trainings already. We're not waiting, okay? So respect the pronouns that individuals are using for themselves. Provide opportunities for self-identification. Build gender inclusive facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms. In my department, Student Diversity Initiatives, we have 3 gender neutral bathrooms. So it doesn't matter if you're female or male or whatever you're identifying with, you can use our bathrooms. And that's an important thing to have. Degender dress codes in favor of being too specific, where someone would have to feel uncomfortable. So those are just some of the articles. Now let's go to the chat. Did anyone share any other ways that bias has manifested?
Okay. Not that anyone posted.
Okay, great. So there are also examples in research. When I first came to the university, I was working in HR. And one of these articles that I first read is, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? Okay, so we see that, they performed research and found out that people were being biased against based upon how their name sounded. So the brain was reacting like, oh, these names sound like this, and all sorts of associations impacted that person's chances of getting hired if they were receiving a callback and things like that. And so there are so many things to do to minimize that happening in the workplace. And one of the things to remember is to always favor being objective over subjective. And so when I say that, I mean, use the facts. Like if you're in a recruitment process, you want to make sure that there is a certain standard or a process that people are following. Try to redact as much of that affinity type information as possible that ties someone to a certain identity, because we want to limit people from having these automatic impacts and favoring some people or another, or limiting someone's chances because they associate someone with the out group. Okay, so looking at resumes, black out those names before it even gets to the person who's going to be making these decisions. Here at S&T, we typically use like metrics and things like that. Those things should be decided before it even gets to the review point of the hiring process. So implicit bias predicts liking of intergroup members who are comfortable with intergroup interaction. Lots of research on likability with the in-group, okay? There's so much research on it. And I particularly, there's a book that I've been reading, and it's called Social Cognition, and From Brains to Culture. And it's so much. And that's why I was like, we're going to do a bird's eye view for this talk, because it gets so very detailed, but it really goes into detail about that intergroup bias and how the brain works with that. And since time is going by fast, I do want to go ahead and go to the slide where we talk about what you can actually do. What can you do in your current role? So maybe you are working at the employee level, maybe you're a supervisor or a leader. Well, there's something that we can all do. And the first step is to increase awareness of bias in general and of your bias. So like I said before, take the implicit association test just to start learning about it, okay? You don't have to accept everything that the test says as gold, but you can use that as a starting point. Take advantage of any diversity and inclusion training that's offered in your workplace, just like the opportunity you're taking now with global learning. And there's gonna be many more that they're gonna offer about this topic and going into more detail. You want to learn about different identities. as our world is changing and more people are feeling comfortable being themselves, you're going to be working with a more diverse workplace. So learn more about those identities and don't make it the person in a different group who is different from you. Don't make it their responsibility to teach you. Okay, so look out on your own. There are so many free opportunities online too, like Coursera. They have different training opportunities as well. You can just Google things to start. You can look up research about it to learn. So awareness is huge. Number two, don't make assumptions. Remember, if you don't take anything else away from this talk today, hopefully you remember that the bias is basically this primitive response, okay, to keep us safe. It's a primitive response, good or bad. It's a categorization, looking at people in groups. But we want to get away from looking at people within these social constructs or these primitive ways and questioning those assumptions, okay? We don't want that to impact the way we include people in our workspace. So try to actually question yourself, like, why am I feeling this way? Why do I feel a little bit more, stressed out about working with this person? And overcome that by reaching out instead, okay? So I'm asking a big ask for you as the employee to reach out to your coworkers and talk to people, get to know them. Don't make assumptions, learn about people for their unique, distinct self. Supervisors, I believe they have more responsibility in this because supervisors evaluate employees. They have the responsibility of promoting individuals, evaluating individuals, hiring and recruitment. So it's so important that supervisors reach out to professionals, maybe that's HR or someone, to help them get metrics and processes in place for those performance processes and take advantage of those because you want to be objective. So remember, be aware, don't make assumptions, question those assumptions, be objective, use facts as opposed to feelings, because don't just trust your feelings, because if you trust your feelings, you're going to always choose people who are like you, and you're not going to be able to diversify your workplace if you're always doing that. Provide equitable access to all employees. Maybe you find yourself going to some employees more than others. And if that's so, ask yourself why. Go to each employee, give everyone a chance to use their voice. There is research that has shown that people who have and use the diversity in their workplace actually are more innovative, okay? So they're actually really succeeding. And this is different types of diversity. So it's not about just getting differences around the table and taking a pretty picture and saying we're a diverse organization, but it's about having access, making that space psychologically safe and accessible, and having the physical spaces as well, as we discussed earlier. And then at the strategic level, there's even more accountability and responsibility because they need to be setting some strategic diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. And equity is huge because you want to make sure that people have what they need to actually perform in that workspace, okay? And sometimes that is bringing up the knowledge of different identities in that workplace. It's not up to the person who is different to inform everyone else. And you bring differences into your workplace, you are preparing to meet the needs of your customers and all of your stakeholders. So you want to make sure that you're doing these things at the strategic level and then actually having representation of diversity in leadership. Okay. And so you can never do that if you continue to lean towards people in your in group, doing things the way that you always have, doing what you feel comfortable with. Difference is doing things differently too. So there are structural and systemic inclusion policies and spaces that need to be figured out. And so definitely many organizations are now having like diversity and inclusion workers in their workplace. They have chief diversity officers, but how often are you actually reaching out to them and using them to help with these strategic decisions? So I think that definitely use what you have in place. And I would be remiss if I didn't share what to do if you experience exclusion in the workplace. So if you or someone you know experiences exclusion, if you're comfortable, speak to the person, engage a supervisor if you feel comfortable, if it's needed, file a formal complaint with HR or whatever department handles that, but definitely always document. And I wanted to leave with our information, our contact information in there, because remember, this was a quick bird's eye view, and I hope you walked away with understanding that this cognitive bias, it is primitive, it happens quickly. We need to basically take charge of that because we're not living in a primitive world anymore. It's a modern world. Question those assumptions, but also reach out to us to learn more about it. Is there anything in the chat?
We didn't have any questions, but we have had quite a few very sincere and heartfelt thank yous to you for providing this information and just having this opportunity available. So maybe this is something that we can put back on the calendar maybe for next year and invite even more people, because this is something that I really feel is key. It's very important, and there's not anyone that we work with or interact with that doesn't need to know this information. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Sylvia and let her close out our day.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna slice the ping pong across the table to Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, you're able to unmute yourself.
Okay, I wasn't at first. Thank you. Anitra, thank you so much. Very informative, very timely, much needed, not just ongoing discussions, but actual actions. So looking forward to whatever we each individually can do in regards to diversity and inclusion. Thank you for everyone participating. As I mentioned, this was the last presentation for this series, but we will begin up with our spring series after winter break. So in January, we'll have a new lineup, and we hope that you continue to join us for these engaging and informative presentations. Have a good afternoon, everyone.